Well, good afternoon, everybody, and a very, very big welcome to Abbey Road Studio 2. Now, this particular studio is the oldest pop studio in the world. It was built in 1931, and it is indeed steeped with history. It was in 1952 that the pop charts were first introduced. And between 1952 and 1962, no fewer than 30 #1 hit singles came out of this particular studio. Now, the amazing thing about working in a recording studio is that one day you see somebody who is relatively unknown, nobody's ever heard of them, they come in for a recording, and weeks later they are household names. Now, in 1958, one such artist came in, name of Cliff Richard. He came into this studio, he recorded a few songs with his group, the Drifters, later become the Shadows, and Living Doll got to #1. But I was very honoured, really, that on the 6th of June 1962, I was assigned as a technical engineer who was going to work on a commercial test in this particular studio. Now, I was upstairs with Norman Smith, the balance engineer, and George Martin was the producer that day, and these four young lads walked through those doors, and we looked down from above, and Norman Smith said to me, "Good God, what have we got here?" We had indeed four lads with long hair, because in those days pop artists did not have long hair, only classical musicians, and they were wearing sort of leather jackets. Now that group, of course, as you all know now, is the Beatles. Now on that day they came in with John and Paul and George and a drummer, Peter Best. 4 songs were recorded in that studio this day: Besame Mucho, Ask Me Why, Love Me Do, and Please Please Me. Now, we did nothing else until the 4th of September when they returned, and we recorded a single, Love Me Do. Now that single got into the charts at number 17, which was not particularly brilliant at the time, and it wasn't until early the following year that Please Please Me got to number 2 in the English charts. Thereafter, 18 of the hits of the singles the Beatles made got to number 1. And of 191 of their 210 songs were recorded here in Abbey Road. So it's very, very fitting that this event takes place here today. Now, with much more ado, I'm now going to pass you over to Mr. Rupert Perry, who's the President and Chief Operating Officer of EMI Records UK. So, Rupert Perry.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for coming along today to this event. I don't really have a great deal to say other than Apple and EMI are very pleased and happy that these terrific recordings that were originally released in 1973 on vinyl and on music cassette are now going to be released worldwide on September the 20th on compact disc. And that's the reason why we're all gathered here today to acknowledge this particular event and this release date. I'm very pleased that as well that my dear friend George Martin has also agreed to come along today. There is no one better to talk about this particular these particular pieces of music than George. And so I'd like to now introduce to you George Martin, the producer of the Beatles.
Okay. Apparently I've got to talk to you from here, which is fine. Hello. It's a long time ago, more than 20 years ago today. I grew up in this place. I mean, I came to this building in 1950, November 1950, when I was in my early 20s. And I learnt about recording. I was I imagine myself as being a Rachmaninoff II at the time, and it wasn't until I came to the studios I found out that I wasn't going to be a Rachmaninoff II. And I learnt how to make records the hard way, and worked for 16 years, actually, as a staff member of EMI. And this place, as I say, was my home, and all the people who worked in it were my bosom pals and friends, and a lot of them are still around, like Ken Townsend, for example. Ken and I came almost at the same time. He came a little bit later than I did. So that when the Beatles came along in 1962, I had been recording for quite some time, and I was running the Parlophone label. And I'd made a kind of name for myself by doing comedy records. And in a way, I suppose that had something to do with the fact that John and Paul and George and Ringo and I got on very well together, because when they first came into the studio, of course, they had worked with Bert Camford in Germany, and they'd worked with Tony Sheridan and so on, but they'd never actually made a record before in their own right. And I guess I was a little bit famous then, because they knew I'd made all the Peter Sellers records and the Goons and Flanders and Swan and all Dudley Moores and so on. So that may have had something to do that we did actually take to each other quite well. I thought they were terrific. I didn't think they could write music, but I thought they were terrific. And as Ken said in that first session, there was a song called Please Please Me that was recorded, but it wasn't the Please Please Me that you know. It was a very, very slow and somewhat dreary Roy Orbison type song. And I said, you know, that needs a real kick up the pants if it's going to mean anything. And we left it, and we concentrated on Love Me Do, which became the first issue. And I didn't expect Love Me Do to do anything. It did get to number 17. Largely, I think, because Brian Epstein bought most of the records. But when Please Please Me came along, I really thought it was, once we'd given it a boost and speeded it up, I really thought it was a terrific track. And I did actually say to the boys, gentlemen, you've got your first number one. And that proved to be. And from that moment on, there was no holding them. And they learnt incredibly quickly. They blossomed like hothouse flowers. And their writing abilities soon came to the fore. They showed me they could write not just great songs, but hit songs as well. And everything they brought to me was fantastic. And the three of them, who were the writers, John, Paul, and George, eventually became the best-known writers of our lives, really. And I guess I'm very, very privileged to be part of that story. Now, what we're here today is to listen to, or to be aware of the translation to CD of all the collections of the Red and Blue albums. Obviously, it had to happen sometime, because CD is the medium that we have today. Translating it from analog to digital isn't just a dead simple matter of putting on a tape and picking up a CD disc at the other end. And the staff of Abbey Road are the people who have actually made this possible. There are a great number of unsung heroes in this place. I get the attention, along with the boys, and to a lesser degree Ken, but there are an awful host of people who are really the heroes, who work on these things and don't get any attention at all. And they're the people that we should be grateful to for making these records sound so good. I hope you like them. Okay.
We'd like to play the whole double albums, I'm sure, but I hope you enjoyed those brief tracks from both the Red and Blue albums. I'd like to invite George Martin down here, please, who's... we're going to do the photos in front of this display down here, so if we could have the photographers round. George. I've just been told there is somebody here who you might be interested.
Hello, folks. We're having a photographic session. A little bit, one. I'd like you to meet somebody that is much more important than any of us here. George Harrison. George, would you like to come through?
Okay. We're out the way. Yeah.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for coming. It's nice to see you all and see you still interested in the Fab Four. I brought you some incense. Lest we forget, all you need is love. Oh, yes, well, it's still around.
Handshake, perhaps?
That's the one.
Up here, guys. That's right, they're having a meeting. We need someone to escort George Harrison out. Escort him out.
They're just having a meeting.
Thanks, George. Thanks, mate. Great. Thanks. This lady, Claire, will escort you out. Claire will escort you out.
Many thanks to George for coming along. Would you like me to be here? You're sitting with me.
No, I'm standing next to you, mate.
Aren't you? Can't you sit down?
No, I'll
No,
stand.
come.
No, I like to see. Go on. You're the famous one. I'm just here to... Can we go to, Mr. Lighting Man, can we go to a bit more lights on the audience so we can see who's asking the questions, please? Right, we could lose the photographers now. We'll give everyone a chance.
Thank you. I reckon Ken Townsend ought to be up here because if somebody's bound to ask me a frightfully technical question and I'm going to look really stupid and not know the answer.
He can do a press conference later.
Okay.
Right, who's for grabs? Who wants to ask the first? Gentleman here. Can you tell me exactly? We've got microphones for you.
Could you tell me exactly why it took so long for these albums to be released on CD? And is there anybody here who can tell us how much the records sold up to now?
No, I can't. I mean, that's a record business question. And I can tell you one of the reasons why it's taken so long to do, to put it on CD, I think, is that we weren't very happy about being translated to CD until we actually got to grips with it. I mean, translation from analog to CD is not an easy business. It isn't just a matter of, as I say, of putting a tape on and pushing a CD out the other end. So there was a lot of heartfelt searching on this one. They wanted to get it right. As to the question of how much has been sold, I've absolutely no idea. Anybody like to answer that elsewhere?
About 20. Okay.
Do you want to come up here with me, Rupert?
Yeah, he's ready.
How much do you listen to the songs afterwards you have produced them? Do you tend to leave them alone, or do you want to listen to them all over and over again? And how many times would you like to change things after listening to them?
To be honest, not at all, because I must confess to you right away now that I'm not a person who normally looks back a great deal. In fact, when I did the Pepper film, you know, which was a South Bank film, that was the first time I really took a really deep look back at old recordings. And people are often amazed at this, but I don't keep anything. I haven't got any memorabilia. You won't find any I don't think I have a complete set of records anyway of the Beatles. So I don't normally go back and listen. In this case, of course, I did, because I listened to every track on the CDs and compared them with what we had on the vinyls. But I don't think I would want to change anything. There are obviously discrepancies, there are silly bits and pieces here and there are different balances, and why the hell did I do that kind of thing? But it's history, isn't it? And if you changed it, I did what I thought was right at the time, and I wouldn't want to change it now. Contrary to John Lennon, who when I was with John in we had an evening together in the Dakota building not long before he died, and we were chatting about old times, and John said to me, I'd like to do everything again. And that shattered me, because I thought we made some pretty good records. I said, everything, really? I said, what about Strawberry Fields? He said, especially Strawberry Fields. So, there you go.
Lady, you stand up, please. Sorry.
What does Michael Jackson think about all this? Because he owns the song, doesn't he?
I'm not hearing that one.
That's Michael Jackson. What would you think he thinks about the
What would Michael Jackson think about the releases?
Yeah.
Could you speak into the microphone, sir?
Yeah. I don't know. Perhaps you ought to ask him.
How much does he get per song or per record?
Michael Jackson's Michael Jackson. I work with Michael Jackson. I did a couple of tracks with him and Paul McCartney. And he's a very serious musician, and he loved the Beatles recordings, I know that. What he would think of these, I have no idea. I hope he likes them. Paul McCartney?
No, music publishing. I think we can leave that one.
Okay, right.
Mr. Martin, it may be a technical question, but can you give us an example of perhaps the kind of thing that was involved in the transfer to digital, choices or difficulties or such that you would have run into, and perhaps how it was originally tracked or such?
Well, I tried to pay a little bit of tribute to the staff of Abbey Road here earlier on, and I'd like to sort of reinforce that now by saying that many hours were spent listening to the analogues that we put out and the transfer to CD, and indeed the mixes that we had, because the old question of mono releases versus stereo came up. And as you know, all the early recordings were never designed to be stereo, but there was so much pressure in America particularly, and also here, for us to release the early stereo versions of some of these songs, that I had to look at that. And we tried actually creating stereo mixes, which I chucked away eventually because I said, no, this is not authentic. And you will find, however, for the first time on these new CDs, that only 4 tracks are mono, so that we have actually gone towards giving stereo now on the earlier tracks. As for the translation to CD itself, it isn't a simple matter, because CD doesn't have all the information on it that an analog has. It's a simple, bald scientific fact. And engineers all over the world have been trying for ages to try and meet that shortfall. But CD has so many other advantages that it's well worth having. So that in translating from analog to CD, you do have to cook a little bit. You do have to make it sound like an analog record. If you didn't, it would sound very harsh, very clinical, and certainly not what I intended in the first place. I don't know if that helps. It's not a technical answer, but it's my answer.
Yes. Aren't you a bit bitter about never being credited as a co-writer of quite a few Beatles songs?
Let It Be? Sorry?
No. You have co-written some of the Beatles songs. Well, as a composer. You've made arrangements.
I've made arrangements and I've contributed, but I'm certainly never written a song of the Beatles. They were the geniuses. I mean, let's face it, give them their due. They were bloody marvellous. I did contribute. I wrote little snatches here and there. I wrote the little bit in My Life. I contributed some of the solos. I remember on Michelle, for example, George and I created a little solo there. Little bits and pieces, and of course arrangements, scores and so on. But that's not writing the songs.
Yeah. In 66 or 67, the Beatles stopped playing live. Was that a good thing for you as a producer?
Was that a good
thing for you as a producer? Was it a creative process?
It had gradually built up to that state. I mean, the boys were getting more and more fed up with performances. They were suffering a lot of hassles. I think if you watch my television program, we related the sort of setbacks that the Beatles had during 1966. And Revolver, the album before Pepper, was the beginnings of their writing songs which couldn't be performed. You know, no one could have done Tomorrow Never Knows. In fact, no one could now even remix it because that was a live thing. So they were gradually working into a studio environment. And by the time we got to Pepper, it really was like painting a picture or making a film. It was something that we were doing without any sense of performance. And that's what they wanted. They didn't want to be live. It's rather funny that all these years now later, Paul is going around doing a fantastically good show. And for the first time, you're hearing Beatle performances. Because we've got modern technology to help him. And it's a really good show. Go and see it. All right, next one.
Mr. Martin, how much did you have to do with the selection of the tracks on these collections, and do you think that they're representative?
No, I had nothing to do with the selection of tracks, except they said, we're going to play these tracks to the audience. Do you mind? And there's any one substitute? And I looked at them, I said, no, they're fine.
I think it means for the albums overall, the red and blue.
I'm talking about the red and blue, yeah. No, I didn't select the tracks. They were done by people at EMI, and I just said, okay, fine by me. It doesn't matter what you play, you know. It's a broad sample.
You didn't select the tracks, but are there any tracks that you would have liked to see on there and that aren't on there?
What was this?
Would you like to have seen any tracks on there that aren't on there?
No. I mean, it's a very large catalogue that you've got on the red and blue tracks. And what they've done is to duplicate what they did in the vinyls. So it would be silly to change it from that point of view. There will be, eventually, something else coming out later on, not for a while, because we're looking at covering everything now that the Beatles have ever contributed to, and sometime we will tackle that one. But this is about as comprehensive as you'll get for quite a time.
One more, come on. Can you speak into the microphone?
Yes, I'll ask a question for these people. They come from Argentina, and I want to know, what can you say about those famous BBC tapes of the Beatles? I think they talk about the radio tapes. Will they ever be released?
They will be put out in some form at some time, and that comes into my previous answer. We're looking at that. I've done quite a bit of work at the invitation of the EMI on BBC tapes. The quality hasn't been very good, and for that reason we're not actually doing anything at the moment with them. So be content with the red and blue for quite a while yet.
Sorry, this gentleman here has no chance. I'll come to you next.
Which track was the most difficult to do, and which one was the one with the hardest work paid off?
To translate to CD?
No, for the Beatles to do in the studio while you were there.
Of all the recordings I've ever made, which was the hardest to make, you mean?
And which was the one where the hard work paid off?
Oh gosh, there's so many. It's so difficult to give a memory back. I mean, looking back, the nice thing about looking back is you tend to remember the good things and not the bad things. And there were lots of wonderful moments in this studio, lots of great fun and great giggles. There were also lots of very boring times and very tiring times. You know, we would work from 7 in the evening through to 5:30 in the morning, that kind of thing. And I sometimes fell asleep. I can see the headlines tomorrow. Yeah. That's why they were so good.
Sir. Okay. What is the main difference between the mastering this time and when you did the original original mastering of the tracks?
Technically, I can't give you an answer to that one, and Ken Townsend will probably be able to give it. I don't know if we want to do that, Ken. It is just that as the years go by, technology improves, and we do get better. And this, what you're hearing now, is the best we can do at the moment. I think it's pretty good. But it's still not as good as I want it to be. And I think we will, in years to come, maybe have another look at it.
Just right to that. If there's anything you weren't satisfied with from the original masters, from the fashion in music at the moment, what would you do in that circumstance?
I'm not sure what the question says, but I like the original masters. I like them the way we put them out, first of all, in the 1960s. And if I had my choice, I would always listen to the tapes in the studio as I heard them. But even translating to vinyl, they changed. And of course they change with whatever machine you play them on. So we're talking very subtle stuff here. And the CD is the most universal and standard way of putting out music now, and it's most reliable. So what we've tried to do with these translations is to get the spirit and the sound that I remember in the studio that then you would hear naturally with your CD player at home. And you'll have to judge for yourself whether we've achieved that or not.
It's the last one.
You'll correct me if I'm wrong, but you were known to have said at the time that the White Album was full of rubbish and that I'd prefer to edit it as a single LP. I would like to know what is your feeling about that now?
Oh dear, I'm still not sure of that one.
Okay. He's throwing quotes back at you, George. He's suggesting that you wanted the White Album to be a single album.
All right.
And
is George still here? Yes, I did want the White Album to be a single album, but only because I guess I was getting fanatic by this time, and I wanted the very best to come out. I thought the Beatles were the greatest thing that I'd ever encountered, and I wanted them always to be that way. So that when they came back from their various trips and presented me with something more than 30 songs, I said, well, these aren't all great. They're all pretty good, but some are great songs, and some are also rans. Let's pick out the great songs and make out a single album. And they didn't want to do that. They wanted to put everything down. Because by this time, each one of them was wanting to go to lead their own lives. And who could blame them? They've been prisoners of fame for nearly 10 years. And so we did actually issue a double album. Now, in retrospect, it worked out very well. And many people I've spoken to believe that the White Album is one of the best issues we ever did. So my wishes at that time maybe were the wrong ones anyway. So I'm quite philosophical about it, and I like the White Album. So my decision at that time, or my opinion at that time, was obviously been changed by history. Okay.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you.